Hello, this is Brian. Today is Tuesday, December 26, 2023, and I'm here at the Lakeside Linkage Preserve here in Lakeside in San Diego County, and it's time for a Shrubs of San Diego County episode. First episode of anything dealing with shrubs or trees of San Diego and county in a while. And today, I want to focus on this massive cactus here. This right here is Mission Prickly-Pear, or Indian fig cactus. So Opuntia ficus-indica. Now, this is a large to very large shrub in the, what else? The Cactus family, the Cactaceae. This plant, I believe, is native to Mexico and Central America, but I think some of the origins of this plant have been lost to time. I'll double check and fact check myself, and obviously post whatever information that needs to be posted regarding that on the screen. But we're gonna have to take time to just appreciate the size of this plant. This is a biggin. So what we have here is a large succulent trunked cactus that can get very large and way over your head. And it is a close relative of our native prickly pears here in Southern California, like Opuntia littoralis, Opuntia vacei, Opuntia occidentalis, Opuntia engelmannii, variety engelmannii, Opuntia ficus-indica, Opuntia basilaris, variety basilaris, and variety brachiclada. Those are all types of prickly pears we have growing here, native to Southern California, and some of which are growing here on the hillsides, which are not in view at this current time, unfortunately, so I can't do any contrasting. But one thing that stands out, the size of the pads on this plant. Indian fig cactus has the larger pads, much larger than our coast prickly pears, or even our chaparral prickly pears, Opuntia auricola, which is another species that could be possibly found in the area. The pads on this one are much larger. These pads are up to 2.5 feet long at least. And the one thing that sets this apart from our other prickly pears is its really tall height. Again, I don't see them all this tall, but they can get up to at least 10 feet tall. This one's probably about 10 to 15 feet tall. And the coloring of the pads of this plant, not much different than our coast prickly pears and a lot of our other native prickly pears, kind of a grayish light green. So if you're wanting to tell the difference between the non-native Indian fig cactus or Mission prickly pear and the natives, a lot of times it's going to be the size of the pads and the size of the plant. Much more upright. The only one in this area that would be close to being as upright would be the Opuntia auricola, the chaparral prickly pear, but I've never seen them get even half this tall. Half this tall. And their pads are much more distinctly rounded as opposed to oval or sometimes even paddle shaped like these ones. And another thing is, some of the trunks on these prickly pears are absolutely gargantuan. Let me see if I can get a perspective on it. Well, you can see the branches on these prickly pears are former pads. They're older pads that hardened and continued growing outward. A pad will grow on the end of another pad, and a newer pad will grow on the end of the second pad, and another one will grow on the end of the third pad and make this branching structure, which is pretty typical in prickly pear cactus And that's the same for a native species as well. So they get this size by just growing, and they are very well suited for these dry coastal sage scrub habitats here. So before this plant naturalized and became part of our wild landscape, this used to be a landscape plant, which it still is. It still is a landscape plant to this day, but pieces of these plants break off, and a lot of times they'll form roots. When a pad breaks off and makes contact with the soil, if the bottom part of the pad or even the side of the pad makes enough contact with the soil, it'll take root and form a genetically identical new plant. So let me walk around this a little bit, try to get a few pictures, and I'll try to talk about some more of the features of this plant here, and talk a little bit more about some of the economical and agricultural uses of this plant. I'm hoping I can get enough of a shot in here to show you what the trunks look like, because I am not bushwhacking into this spiny plant. No chance in heck. But you can see some of the lower branches, and some of these trunks get massive. In there, that's a massive trunk right there of the, not this, but that over there. That's a trunk. One of the trunks on, a massive trunk on this prickly pear. So we know, a lot of people know that cactus plants are very well adapted for very dry, arid climates, a lot of them. And this one's no different. They can grow in coastal sage scrub, xeriscape gardening, and in basically desert conditions. And their fleshiness is where you store a lot of the water to allow this plant to be able to grow and photosynthesize. So this is basically, this pad here is a storage facility for water. That's why these things are pretty fleshy, and that's why we get succulents. Succulents are succulent because they store water in lean times of rain. So this plant is basically subtropical to adapted to subtropical, probably tropical and Mediterranean type climates, especially drier versions thereof. And so, did you know that cactus plants have leaves? I kid you not. Cactus plants can have leaves. There are some species that have leaves all the time, and there are some species that only have leaves part of the time. So I want to talk a little bit about the leaves of cactus plants. Some species, there are some species that actually have regular leaves all the time, especially in wetter climates, or at least most of the time. Prickly pears generally only have leaves for very short periods of time. And usually when you're going to find new leaves on a prickly pear cactus is when a new pad is growing. I don't see any new pads growing, but if you ever look at a prickly pear cactus in the springtime when new pads are coming out, you'll see a new pad with these little green cylindrical fleshy protrudences. They're kind of green and cylindrical, maybe about that long. They're really fleshy. They look like fleshy spines. Those are the cactus leaves of the prickly pear. And that goes for non-native prickly pears and our native prickly pears. I have some coast prickly pear at home, and I've seen them when they've gotten those new little fleshy green cone-shaped leaves when the new pads come out. They last for a very short amount of time before they eventually wither away, and then you're just left with a pad with spines on it. Now, Mission Prickly-Pear, it depends on the plant. It can have varying amounts of spininess. This one here has a low to moderate amount of spininess. You can see we do have some spines here. But there are some that are cultivated to be relatively spineless or almost spineless. And some of them will be fairly spiny and in between. This one here seems to have a few spines, and I'm trying to see the spines, how the spines are. Spines are relatively flat in cross section, at least the ones that I've touched, and I'm not trying to touch that many. But then these little spots, these little dots called areoles, you also can get these little fuzzy spines called glochids. Those are the ones that make a really stinging sensation and rub into your skin, and they're hard as heck to get out. So again, caution is always advised when touching a cactus plant. So these spines themselves are often considered as modified leaves themselves, the spines. Depending on the amount of spininess, some prickly pear cactus plants are so spiny that the spines actually create a shade over the pad to keep the plant cooler and even retard more water loss. So some prickly pears are so spiny, other cactus plants are so spiny that the spines are dense enough to shade the plant from the direct sunlight. So the pad is basically a branch or an extension of the stem. So if it's a branch, why is it green? Well, being that it grows in an arid climate where water's at a premium, it takes the function of what normal leaves would do and photosynthesize. So this plant can photosynthesize in the middle of the hottest, driest summer on record and still be producing food. So the green structure of the branches and pads, the upper branches and pads, allows this plant to photosynthesize even in the absence of formal leaves. Again, spines are modified leaves. They're not formal leaves. They're vestiges of leaves. And when the plant does have leaves, again, they're kind of small. They're shaped like fleshy spines, and they're very soft. They don't poke you like spines, like the regular spines do, just so you know. And a lot of times the leaves will come out of the areoles as well. So now in my next segment, I want to talk a little bit more about the agricultural and horticultural aspects of the Mission Prickly-Pear. So, Mission Prickly-Pears have been a staple in the landscape for quite a long time. These were probably brought over by the Spanish traveling up from the south. And a lot of times these will make pretty cool gardenscape plants for aesthetic landscaping. However, they're not just good for planting. They're not just good for planting and looking at. And again, this is one that has escaped from probably somebody's garden years and years ago. These also have some economical importance as well. Now, in the late spring and early summer, these plants will get these beautiful yellow flowers that after being fertilized turn into these berries. These here are berries. These are not ripe yet. They're going to turn a purplish reddish color when they're ripe. And these are what in Spanish are called tunas. The tuna is the prickly pear fruit. And a lot of prickly pears have edible and a lot of times even very delicious fruit. So once they turn purplish red, you can do a lot with them. You can eat them after you obviously scrape off the outside where the spines are, depending on if yours is not a spineless variety. But these have been economically important for agriculture because their fruit is edible and in some varieties very delicious. So you can make candies out of them. You can make juices. You can just eat them after the spines have been scraped off. So there is some economical importance to that. But it doesn't just stop there. The pads of the plant. Now again, if you're doing this agriculturally, you're going to want a more spineless variety. But if not, you'll have to scrape the outside of the pads to get rid of the spines, and especially the glaucids, those fuzzy ones that really sting when they hit you, because you don't want that going down your esophagus, believe me. So if properly prepared, or if it's a spineless variant, these are what we call nopales, nopalitos, which are the pads. And the pads are edible. I don't know if you have to do any cooking or preparation. Like I said, I'm not really a cooking and culinary expert, but the pads were used for food. You go to your grocery store, you can buy nopalitos in your grocery aisle, probably in your canned vegetables section. And sometimes you can even find them in the produce department, fresh. And I believe that's not just limited to these prickly pears. I think other species you could probably do the same thing with. I'm assuming our natives are done that way, but again, a little more research would probably be prudent before just assuming everything is all hunky-dory. So I always like to throw in a little cautionary tale, do a little research, but the fruits of ours are edible. The other prickly pears, I think, except for maybe the beaver tail cactus. The beaver tail cactus, I don't know if it's even fleshy enough to eat, but that's a story for another spotlight video or whatever. But yes, but yet that's not where this ends. So you've been probably noticing white splotches on some of the pads of this cactus. This is created by a type of a bug, and it's called cochineal scale. Cochineal scale, and this also affects our native prickly pear cactus plants, but these insects form these white casings that, if squished, and being a person who has a lot of respect for animals, I don't really like to go into this too much, they exude some red dye, a reddish dye, that is sometimes used for food coloring. Now, I personally don't go around squishing cochineal scale because it is a living creature, and I mean, that's beyond the scope of what I want to talk about, but this has been used as a carminic dye for food coloring and stuff like that. So, again, I want to leave beliefs and stuff like that out of the equation. Nowadays, you can synthesize your own red dye, but I figured I'd have to point out that there are a lot of economical, agricultural aspects to this plant. And nowadays, it has come to the point where it's naturalizing in our wildlands. So where we are is in a section of coastal sage scrub here in San Diego County, east of San Diego. We're in Lakeside, which is near Santee and El Cajon. And sometimes plants in people's yards and ranches, pieces of it will break off, fall down the hill, and get established in wildlands. So there is a cautionary tale that I need to share. This cactus here can take over some space from the natives. I have seen it locally invasive, usually not overly prevalent in wild places, but it does pop up, especially in low elevations, mostly below 2,000 feet. And it can become a concern if it gets too spread out. So if you were to use it in your garden, and that's, this is a great plant to have. I mean, there's a lot to do with this plant. Admire its beauty, its beautiful flowers, its edible fruit, its pads, nopalitos. And sometimes it's very large size and beautiful architecture. But just make sure you try to keep it within bounds. If you're planting it, if you live on the rim of a coastal canyon or something, make sure the pads don't, make sure if you see a pad drop over the fence to the coastal canyon, make sure to go get it out before it spreads and overtakes our native prickly pears. And that brings me to the next point of what I want to talk about. Prickly pear plants are closely related. our natives are closely related and they hybridize. Well, the Mission Prickly-Pear is also a close relative, close enough to where it can also hybridize. So, it has occasionally happened, it does occasionally happen, where the pollen from a native mixes up with a non-native stigma, or the pollen from a non-native mission fig cactus gets into the stigma of a native prickly pear, which can result in hybrid offspring. So that is a potential problem that does need to be monitored if we are going to be talking about the Mission Prickly-Pear. It can hybridize, and I believe there are probably plenty of records of it hybridizing with our native prickly pear. So that is a cautionary tale. This plant looks very much in place here, but it's not native, and it can potentially upset the balance and contaminate the gene pool of our native prickly pears. So that is a cautionary tale. Again, if you do decide to grow this plant, and I'm all for growing ornamental plants. I love ornamental plants, I love native plants, I love plants, period. If you watch enough of my videos, you know that. But just remember, keep it in bounds, and just make sure it doesn't spread beyond your property. Make sure it doesn't get out into the wild. This is, like I said, this is a wild specimen here. This is a wild specimen that must have broken out from somebody's house. Again, Mission Prickly-Pear, much larger in size, much larger pads, much larger trunks, sometimes tree-like, and sometimes quite large fruit, quite a bit larger than our native prickly pears. But I believe this is going to do it for my Shrubs of San Diego County episode. First one in a long time, I know. I hope you enjoy watching this video as much as I enjoyed filming it. And I'll see you on another Shrubs, Trees, Plants of San Diego episode coming up soon, hopefully. Hopefully. Thanks for watching.